RoboCop is one of those franchises that has tons of stuff in it, most of which really never caught on aside from the first film. Many of the sequels, spin-offs, TV shows aren't really held to the highest regard when compared to the first film. I personally love the first film, and I love the world it created, but find it somewhat hard to consider myself a RoboCop fan due to these failures and expansion, which is somewhat odd to me because I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and there's tons of garbage that came out of the Star Wars universe. RoboCop 2, in my opinion, is also a pretty good movie, and frankly, I just can't really find that X factor that keeps me from loving this franchise in the way I do something like Star Wars. This intro is entirely to say that there is some reflection between RoboCop's first two entries and Star Wars's, in that both films were successful, with directors that didn't choose to return, and as a result, the sequels were both helmed by Irving Kershner, a director who I think is perhaps the most consistent sequel director of all time. I've already done similar videos to this, one on Empire Strikes Back and one on Never Say Never Again, but it's worth noting he was just a master at taking something and remixing it into something new and interesting, regardless of the fact that it was a sequel. Soon after the release of RoboCop, Edward Neumeier and Michael Miner started writing a sequel, with it needing to be delivered by the end of 1987. The original sequel was set years after the first RoboCop, with the titular RoboCop waking up in a corporate-run America, with RoboCop needing to navigate this new, even more corporate world, essentially expanding on themes of the first. However, the pair was eventually fired from the film during the Writers Guild of America strike from 1988, which would lead to studios looking in different directions for a screenwriter approaching hotshot comic writers of the era like Alan Moore, known for Watchmen, and Frank Miller, known for The Dark Knight Returns. Naturally, Alan Moore, if you know anything about the reclusive comic writer, told Orion Pictures to basically go fuck themselves, but Frank Miller signed on to work on the film pending multiple drafts. Miller originally tried to make the film centered in corporate greed like the original, but Orion wasn't willing to film the project at the time, as it was either impossible or would cost far too much compared to what Orion would be able to spend on the film. Frank Miller would later adapt this story to comic format for Avatar Press, a microcomic imprint that still operates to this day, and had people like Alan Moore and Jonathan Hickman on the roster at one time or another during its history. Eventually, a script would be penned by Miller that the studio agreed would be possible to create. Paul Verhoeven, director of the first film, declined to return to the project, instead working on his 1990 film Total Recall, another sci-fi hit from the director. Again, a bunch of people declined returning, including Alex Cox, who declined fearing sequelitis, Tim Hunter, who didn't like the sequel's humorous tone, before finally landing on Irving Kershner, who hadn't worked in a few years since he did Never Say Never Again, but was able to match Frank Miller's vision for the project as it stood. Orion rushed the production and micromanaged Frank Miller, Irving Kershner, and the cast, which today sounds crazy given the cast and crew's legendary status, but it still happens from time to time to this day, so I guess they did what they did. Peter Weller initially considered declining the sequel, but after reading the final draft was convinced. But Orion was also unconvinced about Weller, feeling that at this point it didn't really matter who was under the RoboCop mask, since audiences really wouldn't know or care about the change that much. Plus, a new actor could have less leverage than a returning star. The effects were again led by Phil Tippett, who worked on the first RoboCop film, and he previously worked with Kershner on The Empire Strikes Back. RoboCop 2 follows a Detroit that's drowning in debts that it owes to Omni Consumer Products, or OCP. Detroit is essentially in danger of foreclosing and being replaced with the OCP's vision of the future. Meanwhile, RoboCop is active as ever, chasing down perps who are selling a new designer drug, Nuke, to the masses, with the drug taking over the city of Detroit's underground. RoboCop runs into Kane, the head distributor of Nuke, and his kid sidekick Hobb, who manages to escape RoboCop. OCP, in the years since the first film, have started developing a new RoboCop, ingeniously titled RoboCop 2. Get it? Like the movie? Anyways, the design they come up with is basically RoboCop, but rather than all the organic portions, the OCP reasons they can just use the brains of the deceased police officers, with these RoboCop 2s, in theory, taking over the police force. However, Dr. Juliet Fax ends up taking the brains of power-hungry death row convicts rather than cops, since sane human brains typically crave death and kill themselves instantly upon activation. RoboCop manages to find Kane's hideout eventually, but RoboCop is outgunned and is badly damaged. Again, RoboCop is repaired, but this time, Dr. Fax got her hands on him, adding new prime directives in an overt attempt to sabotage RoboCop and have her sadistic RoboCop 2 program take precedent over the old, lovable RoboCop. Eventually, RoboCop clears these new directives and again raids Kane's hideout, critically wounding Kane. However, Fax manages to take him and insert his consciousness into RoboCop 2, while Hobb takes over Kane's criminal empire. Detroit, meanwhile, seems to be on the verge of a meltdown. Their cheesy telethon to save the city failed, so the mayor meets with Hobb, who offers to pay the debt if they ignore the widening sale of Nuke. However, Hobb is betrayed by RoboCop 2, who kills everyone but the mayor, on orders from the OCP, since Hobb's plan would spell the end of Delta City if Detroit isn't foreclosed upon for OCP to purchase. RoboCop arrives just in time to find a dying Hobb who tells him what happened. The chairman of OCP is now ready to go public with their reconstruction plan and the new RoboCop 2 model. However, Kane's nuke addiction sets him up on a rampage after a canister is opened by him. RoboCop battles RoboCop 2 and wins, killing Kane's brain in the process. However, the OCP again gets off scotch-free as they throw Dr. Fox under the bus. RoboCop 2 definitely has like a twisted Sunday morning cartoon format in a lot of ways. A new drug hits the streets, and RoboCop's goal is to stomp it out. Kane, the lead villain, becomes an evil RoboCop in his own right. There's even an evil kid sidekick to the lead villain. This doesn't leave a lot of room for characters to have deep arcs, though. People like the mayor and the OCP kind of just do their one-note, kind of cheesy, cartoony selves, and even Ann Lewis is bumped to RoboCop's sidekick, more or less. In fact, you could probably adapt this script into like a 22-minute cartoon format, cut the violence, and have Hobb reform or something, and bing bang boom, you got an episode of the RoboCop animated TV show. However, I think that may have been the point of the film. Again, the satire of this film is kind of hidden in plain sight. You got the 80s obsession with designer drugs, corporate greed, and more still on display. I don't think it added a hugely new angle to this satire, but it's funny seeing characters like RoboCop 2. It's pretty goofy.
You are under arrest. Stop or I'll shoot.
And I think Kirshner and Miller understood very well what Verhoeven was trying to do with the original film and essentially just tried to remix it into something new. It would be tempting to go really dark and edgy and serious with the project, but that kind of defies the thesis of the IP as set up in the first film, so I don't hate the direction they took with it. Plus, much like the first film, there's some good action elements, which I think is something that may have been second nature for people like Kirshner following Empire Strikes Back and Never Say Never Again, both of which rely on action set pieces throughout their runtimes, and Frank Miller, who came up in the comic field and had a really solid eye for action storyboarding, which is essential to that medium and translated very well to this film. Tonally, the film is a mix of dark and goofy, like the first film, maintaining those commercials from the first with gag commercials like Sunblock 5000 being goofy highlights of the film.
Sunshine is too much these days, ever since we lost the ozone layer. But that was before Sunblock 5000.
The mayor's ill-conceived telethon to save the city was a good way to show the degradation of the city's funds and move the plot to where the mayor wants to meet drug lords to cut a deal. But also seeing someone play Born to Be Wild on the violin is delightfully lame enough for such a telethon, thinking back to like those 80s Jerry Lewis telethons. While on the other hand, you have moments like Hobbs' death, gory action, and the lingering effects of drug use as other notes happening in this world that are a bit darker. I think they did a good job playing off the nuke drug too. I think it's funny the OCP has this very Ronald Reagan-esque view on drugs, drawing a hard line but also kind of accepting them in the streets. I think it's solid satire, especially for the 1980s. The film has new music composed by Leonard Roseman in favor of Basil Pilardis. Leonard was a working composer making dozens of films, starting his career on James Dean films, East of Eden and Rebel Without a Cause, but continuing to work pretty consistently. The music is fine, but Basil's score on the first is still always going to be the RoboCop song. Lee Smith edited this film with Deborah Zeitman and Armin Manasian. Smith is most well known for his work on Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, as if we need another connection to Batman in this video. Maneja worked on tons of films and TV up till around 2010, and Zietman really just did this film and Dead Poets Society. The film is edited pretty well though. There's some kind of clunky moments, but it feels pretty close to the first film for the most part, and it's pretty well done. Mark Irwin shot the film and it looks pretty good, honestly. Looks a lot like the first film though. I will say some of the warehouse moments and stuff did look a little bit flat. This guy shot tons of great films though, like Scanners, The Fly, and Videodrome with David Cronenberg, Scream with Wes Craven, New Nightmare with, well, Wes Craven, Freddy Got Fingered with Tom Green, and even Big Mama's House 2 with John Whiteshell. He's been working since the 70s and still works here and there, and is a total legend in the industry, who just works on whatever the fuck he wants apparently. From The Fly to Teen Beach Movie 2, he's seen and done it all, and he did a pretty good job here. Overall, yeah, it's pretty solid. Nowhere near as good as the first one, but I'm a sucker for Frank Miller and Irving Kershner, so seeing them work together on a RoboCop film is cool in my book. I don't have as much to chew on as the first film, admittedly, but the action and satire are good, and it's not a bad film for Kershner to end his career on, with the late director calling it quits following this movie and retiring for the last 20 years of his life from directing. I think the cast is still good, and honestly it's a decent sequel, if admittedly I don't see myself revisiting this one very often, when the incredible original film is sitting on my movie shelf right next to it. RoboCop 2 did alright, making $45 million off of a budget of $25 to $30 million, which seemed to do enough to push RoboCop 3 into production, which would drop 3 years later. Though the film never topped the charts, with Dick Tracy topping the film's opening weekend, though the home video market also notably netted the film another $22 million, the film likewise received mixed reviews. Some pearl clutchers were mad about the child crook, others were finding it a bit half-baked, with some people shrugging and saying, I don't know, it's alright. Rotten Tomato collected some of the archived reviews and placed it in their metric at about 27%, meaning critics at the time seemed tired of old Detroit and RoboCop, but that didn't stop the producers from making a third film.